Jake had been looking forward to this weekend for weeks. After months of dealing with the noise and stress of the neighborhood, he was finally getting a break. The cabin in the woods, miles away from the chaos of the city, was supposed to be his sanctuary. It was a small, cozy place, just the kind of retreat he needed to relax and clear his mind. He had packed his bags carefully, making sure to bring everything he needed to make his stay as peaceful as possible. A few books, a bottle of his favorite whiskey, and a comfortable chair by the fireplace were all he needed. As he drove through the winding dirt road that led to the cabin, a wave of relief washed over him. The trees, the quiet, and the fresh air made him feel like he was finally escaping from the demands of everyday life. The sound of the engine cut off as he parked the car in front of the cabin, and the stillness of the forest enveloped him. He stepped out, breathing deeply, inhaling the earthy scent of pine and fresh soil. This was exactly what he needed. He could already picture himself relaxing by the fire, enjoying the solitude and peace that had always been his escape. He spent the next hour unpacking, taking his time as he organized his things. He set up his favorite chair in front of the window, where the view of the forest stretched out in front of him. The morning sun filtered through the trees, casting dappled light across the floor. He made himself a cup of coffee and settled into the chair, ready to enjoy the silence. Just as he was about to take the first sip of his coffee, he noticed something in the distance. A figure. A familiar figure. Jake squinted his eyes, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Standing at the edge of the property, looking over at the cabin, was none other than Karen, the HOA president. He could hardly believe his eyes. What was she doing here? He hadn't seen her in months, and he had certainly never expected to run into her here, in the middle of the woods. Her face was filled with suspicion, her brow furrowed as she stared at the cabin, her posture tense. She was standing with her son, a young man who looked to be in his early 20s. From the way he was looking at Jake, it was clear something wasn't right. Jake tried to shake off the feeling of unease that was creeping up on him. What could Karen possibly want here? He didn't know, but he was certain that it wasn't going to be good. He hesitated for a moment, then decided to wave at her, hoping to keep things cordial. He didn't want any trouble, especially not on his first day of peace. But when Karen saw him, she didn't wave back. Instead, she gave him a cold, hard stare that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Her eyes were filled with judgment, as if she were looking at him like he had done something wrong. Jake's stomach sank. He had no idea what he had done to deserve her attitude, but he had learned over the years that Karen was never one to let things go. She was always looking for a reason to complain, to enforce her authority over others. Jake had hoped that moving out of the neighborhood would help him avoid her, but here she was, standing on his property, judging him from afar. He stood up from his chair, unsure of what to do. Should he go out there and ask her what was going on? Or should he just leave her to her business? Before he could make a decision, Karen turned to her son and said something Jake couldn't hear. Whatever it was, it seemed to only increase the tension between them. Karen then pulled out her phone and began dialing, her fingers moving quickly over the screen. Jake's heart dropped. Was she calling the police? The idea seemed absurd, but given Karen's history, it wasn't out of the question. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He didn't want to get into a confrontation, especially not in such a peaceful place. But Karen was making it clear that she wasn't going to leave without causing some kind of problem. As she continued talking into her phone, Jake could feel his patience wearing thin. He had spent too long dealing with Karen's antics in the past. Her constant complaints, her need to control every little thing in the neighborhood, it had gotten to be too much. He had finally gotten away, and now here she was, ruining it. The phone call continued, and Jake tried to calm his nerves, but it was hard. The tension in the air was palpable. He watched as Karen hung up the phone and turned to her son, speaking quickly, her voice rising in frustration. From where Jake stood, he couldn't make out the words, but it was clear that she wasn't happy. He tried to ignore it and return to his chair, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The last thing he needed was for Karen to bring the chaos of the neighborhood to his cabin retreat. Just as Jake sat back down in his chair, trying to focus on his coffee, he heard the unmistakable sound of sirens. His heart skipped a beat as he looked out the window and saw the flashing lights in the distance. No way. He couldn't believe it. Karen had actually called the police. His hands clenched around the mug, but he didn't move. What was she doing? Why was she calling the cops over a simple weekend getaway? The sirens grew louder, and Jake watched as a police car pulled up to the edge of the property. He could see 2 officers get out, and for a moment, all he could do was stare. Was this really happening? Was he about to face a confrontation with the police because of Karen? He took a deep breath, stood up, and walked outside to meet them. He wasn't sure what he was walking into, but he wasn't going to let Karen ruin his weekend. As he walked toward the police officers, he saw that Karen was standing behind them, her arms crossed over her chest. She didn't even look at him. Instead, she was staring at the officers, talking in low tones as if she were explaining something. One of the officers looked at Jake, his eyes scanning him as if trying to figure out what exactly was going on. "Good afternoon, sir," the officer said, his voice calm and professional. "Can you tell me what's happening here?" Jake blinked in confusion. "What do you mean? I'm just here for the weekend. This is my cabin." The officer nodded slowly. "We received a call about a disturbance." Jake's stomach dropped. "A disturbance?" he repeated, incredulous. "I'm just relaxing. I'm not disturbing anyone." The officer glanced over at Karen, who was still standing there, her face hard and judgmental. "Karen here seems to think otherwise," the officer said, motioning to her. "She called us because she was concerned about your presence here." Jake couldn't believe it. This was exactly what he had been trying to avoid. He turned to Karen, his patience running out. "Karen, what's going on? Why are you making a scene?" Karen gave him another cold stare. "You don't belong here." She snapped. "You think you can just show up and not follow the rules? I'm the HOA president, and I won't let you get away with this." Jake could hardly believe what he was hearing. She had actually called the police over something so trivial, something so ridiculous. "You've got to be kidding me," Jake muttered under his breath. The officer stepped between them, sensing the tension rising. He said to Karen. "We've been called here, and we've spoken to the gentleman. It looks like there's been a misunderstanding. He has every right to be here." Karen's face flushed with frustration, but she didn't argue. She turned on her heel and walked away, leaving Jake standing there, trying to make sense of the situation. As the police car pulled away, Jake felt a mix of emotions. Anger, confusion, and disbelief flooded him. This was the last thing he had expected on his first day of peace. Jake had barely started to settle into his chair by the window when he heard the unmistakable sound of Karen's voice. It was sharp, filled with frustration, and it made his stomach tighten. He turned his head, trying not to make it obvious that he was listening. Karen was still standing in the same spot, her phone pressed to her ear, talking to someone in a hushed tone. Her words were low, but they were filled with urgency. From where Jake sat, he could hear her speaking rapidly, her voice filled with increasing distress. He knew something was coming, but he didn't expect it to escalate this fast. "Yes, hello." Karen's voice came through the open window, louder than before. "I need to report a man who is acting suspiciously at a cabin just outside the neighborhood. He's not supposed to be here. He's causing a disturbance, and I don't know what his intentions are." Jake's heart sank as he realized what was happening. She was calling the police. The last thing he wanted was trouble, especially after having gone through all the proper channels. But Karen was already painting a picture of a threat, making it sound as though he was some kind of criminal just for being on his own property. "He's at the cabin on, street name," Karen continued, her voice sharp and trembling with what could only be described as a mix of anger and fear. "He's been acting strange, like he's trying to hide something. I need someone to come here, fast. I don't know who he is, but I'm telling you, something's wrong." Jake sat in stunned silence. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. He had done nothing wrong, nothing suspicious, but Karen was already painting a different picture. In her mind, he wasn't just a neighbor taking a weekend getaway, he was a problem. He was someone who needed to be handled. This wasn't just a neighborly concern for her. It was an opportunity to make a scene, to prove that she was in charge, even in this quiet corner of the woods. He had always known Karen had a way of making mountains out of molehills, but this was something else. A simple move to a cabin, a weekend of peace, had turned into a full-blown emergency in her eyes. Her voice grew louder as she spoke to the dispatcher, her words becoming more frantic with each passing second. "Yes, officer, I'm sure," she said, her voice rising. "I've lived in this neighborhood for years. I know everyone here. This man is out of place, and I don't trust him. He's not supposed to be here, and I'm telling you, something is wrong." Jake stood up slowly from his chair, feeling his pulse quicken. He knew there was no use trying to argue with her at this point. Karen had made up her mind, and now, she was involving the police. He could feel his frustration building. He had driven hours to get here, to escape the stress of the neighborhood, and now, Karen had found a way to drag him back into her drama. As the call continued, Jake walked toward the window, his eyes scanning the surroundings. The last thing he wanted was for things to escalate further. He couldn't just sit here and let Karen control the situation. But the thought of dealing with the police again, especially over something so ridiculous, made his stomach turn. He had done everything right, checked in with the HOA, made sure everything was in order, but none of that seemed to matter now. To Karen, he was just an intruder in her world, someone who didn't follow the unwritten rules she had set in place. The worst part was, Jake had no idea why she was so upset. He had done nothing to provoke her, yet she was making it sound like he was a criminal, an outsider who didn't belong. As Karen continued to describe the disturbance, Jake's thoughts raced. He had to think of a way to calm the situation before the police arrived. But before he could plan his next move, he heard a noise, the unmistakable sound of sirens in the distance. The sirens grew louder, growing closer by the second, and Jake realized that Karen's 911 call was about to bring more attention to a situation that was already spiraling out of control. He walked over to the front door, his mind racing, trying to figure out how he was going to deal with the police. The last thing he wanted was for things to get blown out of proportion. He had hoped for peace, for a weekend away from the stress, but now, Karen was turning his quiet retreat into a problem that he wasn't sure how to fix. The sirens were now close enough that Jake could see the flashing lights through the trees. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. It wasn't just about being accused of something he didn't do. It was about the principle of the matter. Karen was abusing her position in the HOA, trying to turn every little thing into a crisis. And now, she was involving the police in something that should have never been an issue. As the police car came into view, Jake stepped outside onto the porch. He had to face this head-on. He wasn't going to let Karen manipulate the situation and paint him as the villain. The police car pulled up to the cabin, and 2 officers stepped out. They didn't seem to be in any rush. They weren't storming in with guns drawn, but their presence made it clear that they were here for a reason. The officer in front was tall, with a stern face, while the other officer was shorter, scanning the area with a professional eye. They looked at Jake, then at the cabin, and then back at him. "Good afternoon, sir," the tall officer said, his tone neutral. "We received a call about a disturbance. Can you tell us what's going on?" Jake took a deep breath and stood up straighter. "I'm just here for the weekend. I've rented the cabin and planned on having a quiet time. I don't know what the problem is, but I'm being accused of causing a disturbance by my neighbor, Karen." The officers glanced at each other, taking in the situation. They were clearly processing what he was saying, but they didn't seem to be jumping to conclusions. "Karen called us, saying you're out of place here," the shorter officer said. "She's saying there's some sort of disturbance. Is that true?" Jake shook his head, trying to remain calm. "Not at all. I've done everything by the book. I've rented this cabin, I've let the HOA know, and I'm just trying to enjoy a quiet weekend. I don't know why she's calling the police on me." The officers took a moment to look over the situation. They saw Jake, standing on his own property, calm and respectful. They saw Karen, pacing in the background, still on her phone, talking frantically. Jake could sense the confusion. They didn't know what to make of the situation yet, But he wasn't going to make it harder on them. He was telling the truth. Now it was just a matter of getting them to see it. The sound of the police sirens pierced the calm of the wooded area, growing louder with each passing second. Jake stood on the porch, feeling a knot form in his stomach. He had always known that Karen had a knack for turning small issues into big problems, but he never expected her to call the police over something so trivial. He watched as the flashing lights of the police car filtered through the trees, growing closer. There was no turning back now. Karen, who had been pacing back and forth on the lawn, looked more satisfied than worried. She had her phone to her ear again, speaking rapidly, still trying to explain the disturbance. Jake could feel the tension building between them, and he knew this wasn't going to end without a fight. His weekend, which had started with so much promise, had now turned into a battlefield. As the police car finally came into view, Jake took a deep breath. He wasn't sure what was going to happen next, but he wasn't about to back down. He wasn't the one in the wrong here, and he wasn't going to let Karen make him look like the villain. The police car came to a stop, the engine cutting off with a quiet hum. The officers stepped out, one tall and one shorter, both scanning the area as they moved toward the house. They were calm, professional, but Jake could see the uncertainty in their eyes. This wasn't the kind of call they were used to. The officers walked toward him, and Jake stepped off the porch to meet them halfway. As he approached them, the taller officer gave him a nod. "Good afternoon, sir," the officer said, his voice neutral but firm. "We received a call about a disturbance. Can you tell me what's going on here?" Jake took a moment to collect himself before responding. "Yes, officer," he began, trying to keep his voice steady. "I've rented this cabin for the weekend. I've done everything by the book, contacted the HOA, informed them about my stay. I'm just here to relax and get away from the city. But my neighbor, Karen, seems to have a problem with that." The officer raised an eyebrow but didn't interrupt. He was clearly listening, but Jake could tell they hadn't yet made up their minds about what was really happening here. "Karen?" the officer asked, glancing over his shoulder at the woman still standing near the edge of the property. She had her arms crossed over her chest now, and she was staring at Jake with a look of suspicion, still on the phone, still explaining her side of the story. "Yes," Jake said, keeping his tone even. "Karen's the HOA president. I've had some run-ins with her before, but nothing like this. She called you guys, claiming I'm causing a disturbance. All I'm doing is moving into the cabin for the weekend." The officers exchanged a look, and Jake could see the confusion in their expressions. They were probably trying to make sense of what Karen had told them and what Jake was saying. The short officer stepped forward, his expression a little more stern. "And this is your cabin, sir?" he asked. Jake nodded. "Yes, it is. I've rented it through the proper channels, and I'm just here for a quiet weekend. No one's been harmed. No laws have been broken." The officer didn't seem entirely convinced, but he didn't challenge Jake's statement. Instead, he turned his attention to Karen, who was still on the phone. The officer said, his voice louder now. "I need you to come here and explain what's going on." Karen's head snapped up, and she quickly ended the call. Jake watched as she slowly walked over to the officers, her face a mixture of frustration and determination. She had obviously expected a different reaction from them. She had thought she could make Jake out to be the villain, but the officers weren't reacting the way she had hoped. As Karen reached them, she didn't even look at Jake. She focused entirely on the officers, eager to make her case. "Officers," she began, her voice sharp. "This man has been disruptive since he arrived. He didn't inform the HOA about his stay. I had to personally call to make sure he was following the rules. I told him he couldn't stay without proper permission, but he's acting like he owns the place." The officer listened carefully, nodding along as Karen spoke, but Jake could see the doubt in his eyes. He could tell the officer wasn't taking her side. The officer said, looking at Karen now. "We understand your concerns, but you're telling me he's breaking the law by staying here." Karen opened her mouth to respond, but the officer wasn't done. "From what he's telling me, this is his cabin, and he has rented it legally. There's no evidence of any criminal activity here." Jake could see Karen's face flush with anger. She had expected the officers to immediately side with her, to jump to conclusions without asking any questions. But now, things weren't going the way she had planned. The officer turned back to Jake. "Sir, I'll need you to remain here for a moment while I talk to her," he said, nodding toward Karen. Jake gave a short nod and stepped back, watching as the officers spoke quietly with Karen, trying to make sense of what was happening. He couldn't help but feel a sense of triumph. Karen had no idea what was coming. As the conversation continued, Jake could hear snippets of the exchange. Karen's voice was getting louder, more desperate as she tried to convince the officers that Jake was causing a problem. But the officers weren't buying it. They weren't interested in her accusations, and they weren't going to take her side just because of her position in the HOA. They were doing their jobs, and that meant seeing the truth for what it was. Jake stood there, feeling a strange mix of anger and satisfaction. He had been pushed to his limit by Karen's attempts to control his life, but now, he wasn't backing down. He was in the right, and the officers were seeing that. It felt good to finally be heard. After a few minutes, the officers turned back to him. "Sir, it seems like this situation has been misunderstood," the officer said, his voice calm and professional. "We've spoken to the woman here, and we've verified that you've done nothing wrong." He looked at Karen now. I suggest you resolve your differences without involving the police next time. There's no need for us to be here." Karen's face turned bright red, but she said nothing. The officers gave her one last glance before turning to leave, their job done. As the police car pulled away, Jake felt a wave of relief wash over him. The worst of it was over, but Karen was still standing there, fuming with frustration. She had lost this round, but Jake knew she wouldn't give up that easily. Her need for control, her desire to be in charge, would keep her coming after him. But for now, Jake had won. He had stood his ground, and for the first time in a long while, Karen's power was no match for him. The air was thick with tension as Jake stood there, watching Karen, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her eyes burning with frustration. The officers, still processing the situation, exchanged glances as Karen stood silently beside them, her face flushed with anger. Jake could feel the weight of her gaze on him, but he wasn't going to back down. He had been doing everything by the book, moving into the cabin legally, following all the procedures. But Karen, as usual, was trying to turn a simple situation into a major problem. Just when Jake thought the situation couldn't get any more awkward, the officer who had been asking questions turned to him. "Sir, is there anything else you'd like to tell us about your background?" he asked, his voice calm but slightly curious. Jake furrowed his brow, not sure what the officer meant by that. "My background?" he asked, trying to keep the frustration from his voice. "What do you mean?" The officer seemed to hesitate for a moment before replying. "Well, we just wanted to confirm something," he said. "Karen here mentioned that you're connected to some kind of military background. Is that correct?" Jake was taken aback by the question. His military service wasn't something he usually discussed with neighbors, especially someone like Karen. But yes, he had served. He had been a major general in the military for several years before retiring. Still, he didn't expect it to come up in a conversation about moving into a cabin. He nodded slowly. "Yes, that's correct," Jake said, his voice steady. "I served in the military for many years. Why does that matter?" The officer looked at Karen, who was still standing there, looking more and more uncomfortable by the second. "Well, it seems Karen didn't mention that part," the officer said, clearly confused. "She didn't mention that you're a major general." Karen's face turned white as she realized what was happening. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. "No, I didn't mention it," she muttered, trying to regain control of the situation. "But what does that have to do with anything?" The officer didn't answer immediately. He turned to Jake's son, who had been standing quietly nearby, watching everything unfold. Jake's son, Agent Matthews, finally stepped forward, his presence commanding attention. Karen's eyes flicked nervously between the officer and Jake's son. She had no idea who he was, but there was something about the way he carried himself that made her uneasy. The officer gave a small nod of recognition. "I didn't realize we had a major general in our midst," he said, his tone now more respectful. "I apologize, sir. I didn't mean to cause any trouble." Jake's son, Agent Matthews, now stepped into the conversation. His expression was calm but firm. "There's been a misunderstanding, officer," he said smoothly, addressing the officer directly. "My father has every right to be here, and I'm sure Karen here is just reacting out of her own frustrations. This is a private matter, and there's no need to involve the police anymore." Karen, still standing there in shock, tried to regain control of the situation. "This is absurd," she shouted, her voice breaking. "You can't just let him get away with this. He's been disruptive, and is causing a problem in the neighborhood." Agent Matthews turned to her, his eyes cold and unyielding. "Karen," he said firmly, "you're mistaken. My father has done nothing wrong. You called 911 on him without cause. He's been nothing but respectful. You don't get to control what he does or where he goes." Karen's face reddened with anger, her hands trembling at her sides. She had always been the one in charge, the one who made the decisions, the one who controlled the neighborhood. And now, here was this man, this stranger, who was completely upending everything she thought she knew. He wasn't just anyone. He was an FBI agent, and he was on Jake's side. Her mind raced as she tried to understand how this was happening. She had made the call to 911 thinking she was in control, that she could manipulate the situation to her advantage. But now, everything was slipping out of her hands. The officer, still trying to piece together what was happening, turned back to Karen. You didn't tell us this was a military matter, or that the man you called us about had such a background," he said, his voice now cautious. "We'll have to take your statement into account, but you're not in any position to make accusations based on assumptions." Karen's mouth opened and closed as if she were trying to speak, but no words came out. She had been caught in her own lies, her own manipulation, and now she was facing the consequences of her actions. Agent Matthews took a step forward, his presence completely commanding now. "I'm Agent Matthews with the FBI," he said, his voice calm but firm. "And let me make this clear. This situation is over. There's no disturbance, no issue. My father is not a threat to anyone here. I suggest you let it go before it escalates any further." Karen's face twisted in frustration, but she had nothing left to say. She had been caught, and there was no denying it. Jake watched the scene unfold, his sense of satisfaction growing as he saw Karen's facade of control shatter before her eyes. This wasn't just about her harassing him. It was about her being exposed for what she truly was. A person who tried to use her power to control others, who couldn't tolerate anyone stepping out of line. And now, she was facing the consequences. The officer, now clearly uncomfortable with the situation, turned to Karen. He said gently, "I suggest you leave it here. There's no need to cause further problems. You've made your accusations, and they've been addressed. It's time to move on." Karen stood in stunned silence as the officers turned to leave. The weight of the situation settled on her shoulders, heavier than she had ever expected. She had lost, and there was no going back. Jake, with his son's support and the officer's acknowledgement, had won. The power she once held was slipping away, and now, it was clear to everyone. She was no longer the one in control. She had underestimated Jake, and now, she had to face the reality of her actions. As the officers walked away, Karen stood frozen, her mind racing as she tried to process everything that had just happened. She had lost, and there was nothing left to do but leave. Slowly, she turned away, her shoulders slumped in defeat. Jake stood there for a moment, watching her retreat, a sense of quiet triumph filling him. It was over. And Karen had learned the hard way that she couldn't control everything, especially not him. The police car disappeared down the dirt road, its sirens now just a distant hum in the quiet of the woods. Jake stood outside the cabin, watching the red and blue lights fade into the distance, a strange mix of relief and frustration flooding his chest. It was finally over. Karen had made a scene, involved the police, and escalated what should have been a peaceful weekend into a crisis. But as the tension slowly ebbed away, A sense of triumph washed over him. He hadn't backed down, and in the end, Karen's control had crumbled. Still, as he stood there on the porch, he couldn't shake the feeling that something more had happened. Karen's world had just come crashing down, and Jake had been the catalyst. She had always thought she could manipulate people, that her authority as the HOA president gave her the power to dictate what others could and couldn't do. But today, her assumptions had been exposed for what they truly were, empty and false. What had started as a simple trip to the cabin had turned into a dramatic confrontation. Karen had underestimated him, and she had made a mistake that would cost her. But for Jake, it wasn't just about winning against Karen. It was about something deeper, something more significant. He had spent years in the neighborhood, silently dealing with her petty demands and controlling behavior. He had never stood up to her directly, but now, in the quiet of the cabin, he realized how much he had been holding back. He had been passive for too long. Today, he had finally fought back, not just for himself, but for everyone who had suffered under Karen's authority. As he stood there, lost in thought, his son, Agent Matthews, walked up behind him. Jake turned and saw the calm look on his son's face. He had seen everything unfold, from Karen's first call to the police to the way she had tried to control the situation. He knew that, as much as Jake had enjoyed the brief moment of victory, there was something bigger at play. "You did well today, Dad," his son said quietly, his voice filled with respect. "You didn't back down. That was huge." Jake gave a small nod, still processing everything that had just happened. "I just don't get it," he said, shaking his head. Why did she feel the need to cause such a scene? It's like she couldn't stand the idea that someone was living their life without her approval. His son looked out at the woods, his expression thoughtful. People like Karen, they can't let go of control. It's all about power, about being in charge. She was threatened by your independence, and she couldn't accept it. So, she tried to bring you down. But you showed her today that she doesn't have that power over you. Jake nodded, understanding what his son meant. For years, Karen had used her position as the HOA president to intimidate others. She had used her influence to control people's lives, forcing them to follow her rules or face consequences. But today, she had tried to impose her will on Jake, and it hadn't worked. The tables had turned, and she was the one left looking powerless. "I guess I've been letting her get away with too much for too long," Jake said, his voice quieter now. "But today, it feels different. Like I've taken control of my life back." His son gave him a small smile. "Exactly. You didn't just stand up to her. You stood up for yourself. And that's something she's never going to understand." The words sank in, and Jake couldn't help but feel a sense of clarity. He had been passive for so long, letting Karen and others like her walk all over him. But today, he had stood up, and it had made all the difference. He was no longer a victim of her power. He was free. As the minutes passed, the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the cabin. The silence of the forest was calming, but Jake couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that Karen wasn't done yet. She had lost today, but he knew her well enough to know she wouldn't give up that easily. She would find another way to fight back, to regain control. But Jake was ready for whatever came next. He had learned something important today, that no one, not even Karen, could control him unless he allowed it. His son placed a hand on his shoulder, pulling him out of his thoughts. "Let's go inside. You've earned a break." Jake looked up at his son, a sense of pride filling him. "Thanks, son," he said, giving him a smile. "I think I will." As they walked toward the cabin, Jake couldn't help but feel a shift inside him. The power he had once given to Karen, the control she had held over his life, was gone. And for the first time in a long time, Jake felt like he was truly in charge of his own future. Inside the cabin, as the fire crackled in the hearth and the smell of fresh coffee filled the air, Jake finally allowed himself to relax. He had faced down Karen and won. But more than that, he had taken back something far more valuable, his freedom. And as he settled into the comfort of the cabin, he knew that this was just the beginning. He wasn't going to let anyone, least of all Karen, take that freedom away from him again. The lessons of the day were clear, and Jake was ready to move forward, stronger and more confident than ever before. The evening had settled in, casting a golden glow over the cabin and the surrounding woods. Jake stood at the window, looking out at the peaceful scene, but his mind was elsewhere. The events of the day kept replaying in his head: the confrontation with Karen, the police arrival, and the unexpected revelation that his son, Agent Matthews, had changed everything with a few simple words. As he stood there, the weight of the situation started to sink in. This wasn't just a small neighborhood dispute. This had bigger consequences, and Jake knew it. The entire neighborhood had witnessed Karen's downfall, and now, word would spread. The power dynamic in the community had shifted, and there was no going back. Jake had always been the quiet, reserved neighbor. He had kept to himself, trying to avoid conflict. But today, he had stood up for himself, and in doing so, he had broken the cycle of control that Karen had maintained for so long. He felt a strange mix of satisfaction and unease. While he had won today, the price had been steep. Karen wasn't going to let this go. Jake could already imagine the whispers in the neighborhood. Karen, the HOA president, had lost her grip on power. People who had once feared her were now talking about her failure. The very people she had tried to control would now see her for what she truly was: someone who couldn't handle losing control. He knew she wouldn't stay quiet for long. Karen was nothing if not persistent. And Jake wasn't naive enough to think she wouldn't retaliate. He had seen her in action too many times. But today, something had shifted. Karen had overplayed her hand, and now, she was the one in a vulnerable position. Jake's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of his son's voice from the kitchen. "You okay, Dad?" Agent Matthews asked, walking into the living room with a cup of coffee in his hand. Jake turned to him and gave a small smile. "Yeah, just thinking," he said. "About what happened today, I guess. And what comes next." His son sat down across from him, the warmth in his eyes softening his usual, professional demeanor. "I know it wasn't easy, but you handled it well. You didn't back down." Jake nodded slowly. "I didn't want to, but it's not over. I know Karen's going to make another move. She's not the type to just accept defeat." Agent Matthews took a sip of his coffee, considering his father's words. "You're right. But today, you put her in check. The whole neighborhood saw it. And Karen? She's lost her credibility. People won't take her seriously anymore." Jake let out a long breath. "I hope you're right. I've lived here for a long time, and I've seen Karen do things that, well, things that no one should have to deal with. I've let her get away with it for years, but this time, I had to stand up. I couldn't let her control me anymore." His son smiled. "You've done more than stand up, Dad. You've set an example for the rest of the neighborhood. You didn't just take the high road. You showed everyone that you're not afraid to fight for what's right." Jake felt a small sense of pride, but it was quickly overshadowed by the nagging feeling that there was more to come. Karen wouldn't just slink away into the shadows, not without a fight. She had built her entire life on her ability to control people, to bend them to her will. Jake had just shattered that illusion. But the question was, how far would she go to try and regain control? Jake had no illusions about Karen. She had always played dirty, using her position to manipulate people into doing her bidding. Now, with the police already involved and her reputation tarnished, he knew she'd be even more dangerous. She had a lot of power to lose, and when people like Karen felt cornered, they often became desperate. "I just don't know what she's going to do next," Jake muttered, his thoughts turning back to Karen. "I have no idea how she'll retaliate, but I'm sure she'll find a way." Agent Matthews set his coffee down and looked at his father with a mix of concern and confidence. "Whatever happens, we'll handle it," he said firmly. "You don't have to face this alone." Jake looked at his son, feeling a wave of gratitude wash over him. His son had been a quiet presence throughout the entire ordeal, supporting him without hesitation. But as much as Jake appreciated his son's support, he knew that this was his fight to finish. He couldn't rely on anyone else to deal with Karen. This was his life, his neighborhood, and his future that was on the line. The next few days would be critical. He would need to stay alert and ready for whatever Karen might throw his way. But there was a part of him, deep down, that felt stronger now. Maybe it was the confidence that came with standing up to Karen. Or maybe it was the knowledge that he wasn't the same person he had been when he first moved into the neighborhood. Whatever it was, Jake knew he was different now. As the evening stretched on, the cabin grew quieter. The fire crackled in the fireplace, casting a warm glow over the room. Jake felt a sense of peace slowly returning, but there was still a part of him that couldn't shake the feeling that the calm before the storm was far from over. He could hear the sounds of the forest outside, branches creaking in the wind, the occasional rustle of leaves, but he knew that the real storm wasn't out there in the woods. It was inside the walls of the neighborhood, waiting to boil over. Jake looked out the window again, this time with a more resolute expression. He had made his stand, and no matter what Karen tried next, he wasn't going to back down. The power she had over the neighborhood was crumbling, and Jake wasn't going to let her pick up the pieces. This was his home, and he would defend it, no matter the cost. As the night fell darker, Jake stood up from his chair, feeling the weight of the day finally beginning to lift. His son had made sure that he wasn't facing this battle alone, and for the first time in a long time, Jake felt like he could face the future with confidence. Tomorrow, he would prepare for whatever Karen had planned. But tonight, he allowed himself to rest. He had already won. Now, it was just a matter of waiting for the fallout. The next few days felt like a waiting game. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that Karen wasn't going to give up that easily. The police had already been involved, her reputation had taken a hit, and she had lost her control over the HOA. But Jake knew her well enough to understand one thing. She wasn't someone who accepted defeat. Not without a fight. Every time the doorbell rang, every time he heard footsteps outside, Jake couldn't help but feel his heart race. Was it Karen, showing up with another complaint? Another scheme? He had hoped that after the police left, after the officers had spoken to her, the situation would die down. But Karen's pride had been wounded, and when Karen's pride was wounded, things always got worse. The house, which had once felt like a peaceful sanctuary, now felt like a battleground. Jake was on edge. The world outside his cabin felt distant, far away, but Karen's influence still seemed to linger, like a shadow waiting to strike. It was only a matter of time. That morning, as Jake sat at the kitchen table, sipping his coffee, he heard the unmistakable sound of a vehicle pulling up the long dirt road. His heart skipped a beat. He knew exactly who it was. He stood up, walked to the window, and saw the familiar flash of a red SUV parked outside. Karen's vehicle. She was here again. His immediate instinct was to turn away, to ignore her and continue his quiet weekend. But he knew better. He had already been through this once, and he wasn't about to let her walk all over him again. With a sigh, he grabbed his jacket and stepped outside to face her. As he walked toward her vehicle, he saw Karen standing by the door, her arms crossed, her eyes narrowed. She looked just as tense as the first time he saw her standing in his driveway. The difference was, this time, she wasn't in control. This time, he was ready. "Jake," Karen said, her voice cold, as she approached him. "We need to talk." He could hear the frustration in her voice, but there was something else there, too. Something that told him this wasn't just another complaint. This was something bigger. "Talk about what, Karen?" Jake asked, his tone flat. "You've already made your point. The police have been here, and they've already cleared up your misunderstanding." Karen shot him a glare, but she didn't back down. "You think this is over? You think just because the cops came and sided with you that it's done?" Her words were sharp, but Jake wasn't fazed. "You called the police over a simple move, Karen. It's over." The truth came out. Karen's eyes narrowed further, but she seemed to take a deep breath, collecting her thoughts. "Maybe it's not over, Jake. Maybe it's just beginning." Jake could see that she was trying to regain control of the situation. He wasn't going to let her. He crossed his arms, waiting for her to continue. "I don't know what you think you're going to do, but if you're thinking of causing any more problems, I'm not backing down," Jake said, his voice firm. Karen looked at him for a moment, and for the first time, Jake saw something in her eyes that he hadn't seen before, fear. It was subtle, but it was there. It was the fear of losing everything she had worked for, of realizing that the power she once held was slipping away. She swallowed hard before speaking again. "I've been in control of this neighborhood for years, Jake," she said, her voice quieter now, almost as if she was speaking to herself. "I've made the rules, and I've made sure people followed them. But you didn't follow them. And now, you think you can just take that from me." The desperation in her voice was more than clear now. She was panicking. Jake took a step forward, his expression hardening. "Karen, this isn't about control anymore. It's about what's right. You can't use your position to push people around. I'm done with it, and I won't let you do it to anyone else either." She opened her mouth, but no words came out. The truth was, she had no more arguments. Jake's words had hit a nerve, and she knew it. He had made it clear that he wasn't going to let her manipulate him or anyone else in the neighborhood. Karen stood there, frozen for a moment, before she seemed to gather herself. "You think you've won, don't you?" she said, her voice cold, almost as if she were daring him to say something. Jake didn't respond immediately. He just stared at her, letting the silence linger for a moment before speaking. "It's not about winning, Karen. It's about standing up for what's right. You can't control everything and everyone, no matter how much you try." For a long time, Karen just stood there, looking at him as if trying to figure out her next move. It was clear she hadn't expected this, hadn't expected him to stand up to her like this. Finally, she took a deep breath and looked away, her shoulders slumping slightly. "This isn't over," she muttered, more to herself than to Jake. "I'll make sure of that." Jake knew that Karen wasn't the type to just walk away. But for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of finality in the air. She had tried to control the situation, tried to push him into a corner, but he had refused to back down. He had fought for his peace, and he had won. Karen, now realizing that she couldn't break him, turned and walked back to her SUV, her steps slow and defeated. As she got into the vehicle, Jake watched her drive away, the dust settling behind her. She hadn't won. Jake had won. And for the first time, he felt the weight of the neighborhood's judgment shift in his favor. This battle was over, and he was the one who had taken control. He didn't know what Karen would do next, but he knew one thing: he wasn't afraid anymore. He had faced her head-on, and he had shown her that he wouldn't be controlled. As the sound of her vehicle faded into the distance, Jake stood there for a moment, letting the weight of the victory sink in. It wasn't just about the cabin or the neighborhood. It was about reclaiming his life. And that, more than anything, was worth fighting for.